You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
Welcome to the Past Macabre, where we journey through history to uncover how our relationship with death reflects the values, fears, and hopes that shape the way people live. I'm your host, Stephanie Rice. Thank you for joining me for episode 34, The Tomb of Fu Hao, Ancient China's Warrior Queen. For Women's History Month, I wanted to share info about a pretty amazing woman. As I said, she's a warrior queen of the very first dynasty in China, the Shang Dynasty. Fu Hao was alive around 1250 to 1200 BCE, meaning that she would have been alive at the same time as Ramses II, also known as Ramses the Great, or about the time that the famous Lion Gate of Mycenae was built, or as the Olmec civilization was beginning to spread their influence across Mesoamerica, just to give you a little bit of temporal perspective about when Fu Hao lived. She was one of the three queens of Wu Ding, and he was known as a wise, fair king who actually got to know his people and walked among them. He created the most prosperous period during the 600-ish years of the Shang Dynasty. And details about Fu Hao's life were preserved on what we now call oracle bones. They hold the oldest evidence of writing that's been found in China, and they were most often like cattle bones, sheep bones, turtle shells, and they were written on and then used in divination rituals that were overseen by the king. We can learn a lot from them, even though it sounds like, oh, why would I need to learn from divination rituals? Because the topics of divination would range from personal questions about the king to questions that would heavily impact decisions that the whole kingdom would feel the effects of. And there are hundreds of oracle bones that mention Fu Hao. In them, she's credited with helping Wu Ding build this prosperous era of the Shang Dynasty period, and we've learned even more since the oracle bones were found. How big of a role she had played during the Shang Dynasty and alongside Wu Ding didn't really become clear until her tomb was rediscovered in 1976. It's near the ruins of the ancient capital Yin, which is near modern Anyang in Henan province. The tomb contained 1,928 artifacts made of ivory, jade, ceramics, and bronzes, in addition to nearly 7,000 cowrie shells. Yes, shells. They're important. I'll get to them in a little bit. All of these have taught us a lot about the Shang Dynasty and the life of Fu Hao. These artifacts, alongside the oracle bones, confirm that she was a diplomatic queen, a strategic military general, and a religious leader who listened to the worries of her people. She even led a region of people herself as a regional ruler. She led successful military campaigns on her own, and she led some of the most sacred religious ceremonies that were normally performed by the king. We will not be going through all 1,928 artifacts, so don't worry, this episode is not that long. We're going to go through a broad overview of Fu Hao and a few specific artifacts that I want to highlight and the things that they can tell us. So let's get started. Fu Hao's tomb was found at the ruins of the Shang Dynasty capital. They called it Yin, and it's now known as Yin Chu, which translates to the ruins of Yin. It's near modern-day Anyang, which is in China's Henan province. The Shang Dynasty is sometimes referred to as the Yin Dynasty or the Yin Shang Dynasty in reference to the capital. Fu Hao's tomb was close to the palace, but outside of the nearby royal cemetery, even though she was clearly buried with honors. There are several theories about why this happened. I'll go into them later in the episode after you have some more context. Whatever the reason for it, I'm very thankful that they chose this location because the royal cemetery ended up being very heavily looted and damaged throughout antiquity. So that makes Fu Hao's tomb the only royal tomb from the Shang Dynasty that was completely untouched by humans before archaeologists rediscovered it. The contents of her tomb, combined with the hundreds of oracle bone inscriptions that have been found that reference her, we now have a pretty detailed picture about Fu Hao's life. But there are two big mysteries about Fu Hao, even with all of the info that we have. The reasoning behind her tomb, as I mentioned, or the tomb's location, is one mystery, but like I already mentioned, we'll dig into that a bit later. The second mystery is that we don't know Fu Hao's actual name. Fu is a title, like the formal title of lady in English, and Hao is her maternal family name, or kind of seen like a clan name. Her given name is completely unknown. There's been some guesses trying to piece together from inscriptions found that possibly reference her, but nothing is even close to certain. But that's actually common for many ancient Chinese royals, and so it's not a slight against Fu Hao personally. Throughout Chinese history, and continuing to a lesser degree today, given names are seen as very personal and they're reserved for only the people closest to you to even know and most definitely to use. While given names aren't really that much of a secret today, it's still just considered more polite to not use them unless allowed to. In ancient China, they were not used. At the very least, they were not recorded in any official records. And even in private matters, they were pretty rarely written down. Some rare examples we do have come from personal artifacts from elite or royal men mostly that were never really intended to be seen by anyone outside of a very small and selective group of people. Based on the evidence that we have, it seems like the given names of women were either more closely guarded than the given names of men, or it is a possibility that they were just deemed not worthy of recording because that happens throughout history because of patriarchal nonsense. Even though Fu Hao's name is a mystery to us, we do know a lot about her and the power that women could hold during the Shang Dynasty. To start, we know that Fu Hao was financially independent from King Wu Ding and very wealthy. The thousands of cowrie shells found in her tomb were used like valuable currency, and they were signs of wealth because they were actually so rare in China. They're from tropical waters, and cowrie shells can't be found on the coast of China directly. The closest would be from the Indian Ocean, which is over 3,500 kilometers or about 2,200 miles away. That's a pretty vast distance to travel through the trade networks, and so that's why they were considered rare. And given that high value, cowrie shells aren't found in very many tombs, and the tombs that they have been found in don't even come close to the amount that were found in Fu Hao's tomb. For example, a text from a few generations later records a gift of 300 shells to a king, and it implies that that was considered a very wealthy gift. 300 was worth noting in historical records, and Fu Hao had nearly 7,000 buried with her. That meant that they were essentially free to lose from the economy for the Shang Dynasty because they were intended to be buried with her for eternity, not dug up and then brought back into the currency system later. The large number of jade artifacts and bronze artifacts that have been found in her tomb, and they're also very high quality, tell us that she definitely had a lot of physical possessions that were worth a lot as well. And in addition to her physical possessions and currency, Fu Hao actually had a whole territory to govern herself. It was sort of like a Western European fiefdom, or kind of like a modern state. She had many people. It wasn't just a, sprawling ranch. She had a lot more land than that, and she was responsible for those people and the land. And there she had her own estate within that larger land, which was separate from Wu Ding's royal states across the Shang Dynasty empire. So she managed all of this location herself, from her estate to the wider regional rule. Wu Ding had no control over it beyond the political aspect of being the king. And even as queen, she still paid taxes like every other regional lord. So that relationship was specifically kept, quote unquote, professional. She didn't get any extra treatment as one of Wu Ding's favored wives. Some of the oracle bones that have been found were petitions to the spirits of nature or ancestor spirits, sometimes both, for a bountiful harvest for Fu Hao's lands. These types of divinations were part of a formal national ceremony, essentially. National, I say with quotes, because they weren't a formal nation as we would recognize it today, but a state ceremony, essentially, that was most likely held once a year around probably like a harvest festival or a New Year's celebration. Every regional ruler participated, and there are several oracle bones that define for other territories and not just Fu Hao's. The presence of these confirms that she was given the same respect as the men who were regional rulers as well. Fu Hao even led several of these types of state rituals herself. And that's a big deal because these were an important part of the religious beliefs that were very closely tied with just the way that daily life worked during the Shang Dynasty. They were not typically delegated out. Normally, they were performed by the king. There are many oracle bones that refer to ceremonies that Fu Hao led, and that has led to some English texts referring to her as a, quote, high priestess. But that type of title wasn't necessarily used to refer to Fu Hao in any of the surviving inscriptions. So it's more of a modern description put on the role that she played. There's also evidence that she performed ritual sacrifices, which was incredibly rare for anyone other than the king to do in ancient China. And yes, during this period, human sacrifices were unfortunately still a thing. Fu Hao was buried with 4 Yue axes, which were symbols of kingship. They were large, crescent-shaped battle axes. The Chinese character for Wang, which translates to king, originally was a Yue axe. In the original Chinese script, that used to be more pictographic than it is now. So that's how deeply connected that the Yue axes were to kingship. They symbolically and functionally represented the power over life and death that was usually very exclusive to the king. They would have been held like ceremonial scepters during any formal religious functions or political functions, but they were also kept sharp and they were used in ritual sacrifices and in executions for crimes. Oracle bone inscriptions confirm that Fu Hao did both of those things just as the king would have. Very, very rare delegated power to give to someone. The king trusted Fu Hao so much that her power over life and death extended to the battlefield as well. On oracle bone inscriptions, Fu Hao is credited with several military amazing feats, such as winning a very difficult battle that secured a very important victory for Wu Ding and led to a big expansion of his control. And there's one oracle bone inscription that specifies that she led a force of 13,000 soldiers by herself. That's an incredibly large amount during that time period that probably would have accounted for almost half of Wu Ding's entire standing army. There are also inscriptions where Wu Ding is talking about her going out in order to conscript more people in order to boost his military numbers during different campaigns. There's also some that talk about her actually leading alongside Wu Ding during large battles that actually required all of his forces instead of falling back into a support role whenever he was present. So she wasn't only just some sort of stand-in, she was also respected as an equal when it came to control of the battlefield and strategizing. She's also depicted as leading and actually participating in very tactical missions like successful ambushes or like pincer maneuvers, or where she and the king attack from different sides simultaneously, those sorts of maneuvers. Plus, in addition to the large Yue axes, her tomb had lots of artifacts that were for warfare specifically. There were bronze blades, some of which she likely used in real battles because they were built very practically. And there were also jade ceremonial daggers, so you don't really need that many different materials of ceremonial daggers. In the archaeological record of ancient China, typically the bronze weaponry was actively used and the jade weaponry was all ceremonial. We know that Fu Hao was an archer too, and she didn't just wield axes and daggers, because there were things like dozens of bronze and bone arrowheads found in her tomb, and likely there was a bow, but unfortunately, bows are made of wood, and they typically don't survive in the archaeological record. Same as the shafts for the arrowheads that they were once attached to. That's why we only have so many arrowheads left behind in the archaeological record and not very many full arrows. Fu Hao's tomb was untouched by humans, as I said before, but unfortunately it was not untouched by the elements. It wasn't completely sealed, and it is underneath the water table where, at least the modern water table, where she was buried. So the tomb had been flooded, and the few tiny remnants of wood that have still been found confirm that most of the wood that was there had rotted away. That's unfortunately more common than not in archaeology. One of the coolest finds, in my opinion, from Fu Hao's tomb is a jade thumb ring that was used for archery. Some ancient cultures and modern archers use these thumb rings to mostly protect the inside of their thumb, but for mounted or chariot archery, especially in ancient China, thumb rings were designed with a notch in them so that they would help hold the arrow steadier while the archer was moving. And they used a different technique for drawing the bow than was used by a lot of the other archers that we have from the ancient world, like the Greeks and the Egyptians, etc., because they were doing a lot more mounted combat. Lots of different cultures have made similar thumb rings, but Fu Hao's is the oldest archery thumb ring that's been found in the entire world. Unlike all of the jade blades, the jade ring was not ceremonial. Ancient thumb rings for archers, especially elite people who were archers, were often made of jade because it's a pretty hard material. There are scratches on the jade ring that was found in Fu Hao's tomb that match up with other jade thumb rings that archaeologists have tested and realized that this shows wear and tear of the ring repeatedly being hit by bowstrings. So the thumb ring was both decorative as a show of status, and it was very practical. It is carved with a lot of intricate designs, as would be fit for a queen. Fu Hao had multiple chariots buried in her tomb, so it seems that she was likely a chariot archer, and this discovery actually led to a new understanding of battle gear for the entire period. Fu Hao's thumb ring was pretty large, even though she was just average size for a woman of the time period based on everything else that's been found in the tomb. But charioteers wore gloves to protect their hands as they managed the reins of the chariot. It's a lot different from when you're doing mounted archery because you can steer the horse with your knees as you use the bow, but as you're going to be grabbing at the reins a lot and having to use them a lot more in a chariot, you're going to need this protection. And so it seems that the charioteers wore these archery rings over their gloves whenever they were chariot archers specifically. It was more obvious that Fu Hao's ring was oversized than it had been in any of the tombs of male warriors who were buried with chariots and archery gear. So, thankfully, because she's a woman, we were specifically able to identify this little detail within the battle gear of the period of the Shang Dynasty. It might seem like a very small difference or detail, but this helps us build a much more accurate picture of what warfare was like in ancient China, and it can help identify other details in the archaeological research of the future. These sorts of little discoveries actually build up quite a lot, because sometimes when somebody actually identifies a thing in one place, people can learn, hey, this matches that over there. For example, there have been several cases where archaeologists were unable to identify a specific tool, and modern craftspeople were able to say, oh, we still actually use a tool very much like that. And that led to a huge wave of identification that hadn't previously been available. And these sorts of things with the thumb rings and the little tiny details of if maybe somebody might not have a chariot burial, but they have the gloves and the ring, so that might equal them being a chariot archer that we didn't know before and can give us a little bit more insight into this person's life. Obviously, I'm biased as an archaeologist, but I think it's amazing what kind of details that we can learn by studying even the smallest things, like thumb rings. Fu Hao helped expand the Shang Dynasty's influence by doing more than spilling blood. There are several oracle bones that record Fu Hao's diplomatic duties in meeting with emissaries or negotiating and maintaining alliances or trade deals. In addition to the cowrie shells that I had mentioned before, her tomb also has artifacts that are evidence of these trade deals based on the materials that they are made of, and in some cases based on the styles. For an example of some of the rare materials found in her tomb, there's a set of ivory cups with very detailed turquoise inlays in her tomb, not jade. Turquoise is fairly rare in China and only found in very small deposits in regions that are pretty far from the Shang capital, at least as far as geologists, archaeologists, and everybody looking has found so far. And given how much the area has been searched for it and how long people have lived in the area, I think it's safe to say that turquoise was not found anywhere near Yin. The closest known turquoise source is about 450 miles or 725 kilometers away. And there's no guarantee that the turquoise in Fu Hao's tomb came from that location and not one of the sources that are even further out from the capital or even outside of modern-day China. So these cups are evidence of trade from distant regions that were not yet part of the early Chinese Empire. Whether it was through a direct connection where Fu Hao or Wu Ding or somebody met with the people of that land directly, or if it was through an expansive connected trade network, this is a very important thing to study because these types of long-distance trade deals were the beginnings of what became the famous Silk Road that was formally established 1,000 years after Fu Hao lived. So researchers really want to study these types of things and how they were formed in order to understand how and why and exactly when the Silk Road began compared to when it was formalized in the historic records. And this turquoise is just one example of many artifacts from her tomb that provide evidence that during Fu Hao's life, the Shang Dynasty was thriving. And the oracle bones confirm that she helped build that prosperity and earn those rare materials and gifts from afar that are in her tomb. Fu Hao's exact age when she died is unclear, but the records that have survived imply that she died fairly young, likely in her early 30s. For some reason, a lot of people like to quote 33. I don't read Chinese, so I could not confirm it in any of the original sources of the archaeology done at the site, but we do know that Wu Ding lived much longer and made sure that Fu Hao was honored and remembered long after she was gone. When Fu Hao was buried, she was given a full ceremony and sacrifices were performed for her. Unfortunately, human sacrifice was still a thing during that period, but she also was given a large shrine that was built above her tomb, which was common for all members of the royal family, and memorial services were done for her for many years after her death at this site. Wu Ding even deified her when she died, so she was elevated to the status of a divine ancestor, or kind of a demigoddess, if I were to use more Western terms for comparison, which would have meant that there were public declarations and celebrations dedicated to Fu Hao. Her posthumous title was Mujin, which essentially meant Mother Jin. And during the Shang Dynasty, these posthumous titles were given to ancestors, and they were specifically tied to the days of the week. There were 10 days in a week for their calendar, and Qin was the 8th day. As Mother Qin, Fu Hao was honored every 10 days on the 8th day of the week on the day that was called Qin, which is why it is very weird that her tomb is outside of the royal cemetery if she was so widely celebrated. It wasn't like she was some sort of secret kept away. And so now we get to the theories about the location of her tomb. One possibility is that it was for love, because Wu Ding loved her so much that he wanted to be able to easily visit her and essentially talk to her, pray to her, whatever term you want to use, on the daily, basically, without having to actually go all the way to the royal cemetery, taking him away from his duties for a much longer period. Fu Hao's tomb is closer to the palace and within the line of sight of the site of the palace, where researchers think that Wu Ding would have worked when he wasn't holding formal court. Instead, the cemetery is a bit further away and not very visible based on what we know of the architecture of the time. In addition to the clear evidence that Wu Ding respected Fu Hao that I shared earlier in the episode, there's evidence that he did care deeply for her beyond just those respectable official duties. Many oracle bone inscriptions provide evidence that Wu Ding actually grieved and was very worried about Fu Hao leading up to her death. There are oracle bones that have Wu Ding petitioning for help or answers when Fu Hao got sick throughout her life, but then near the end of her life, when it became clear that she wasn't getting better of whatever had caused this, he repeatedly asked his ancestors if she was dying, almost like he was seeking for some sort of answer other than the inevitable. One oracle bone has been found where Wu Ding asks if Fu Hao is really gone. And this specific oracle bone helped archaeologists narrow down that she was in her early 30s whenever she died, even though they don't have any remains to study to confirm that. Because the oracle bones were marked with the date that the oracle was made, archaeologists are able to have this point of reference and then work backwards from this clear indication that this was when Fu Hao died, and then they can match it up with other mentions of Fu Hao going back to earlier dates in the other oracle bones. It's still difficult to pinpoint her exact age. There's no universal agreement on when year one happened. Ours is even a random point in time, just like theirs was. And so that makes ancient calendars pretty difficult to convert to the calendars that we use today. Plus, Fu Hao's birth was never recorded. Since she wasn't born into the royal family, she married into it, and we don't know how old she was exactly whenever the earliest mention of her was recorded. But confirmation of Fu Hao's death was not the last oracle bone about her to appear in the archaeological record. Wu Ding continued to have dreams about Fu Hao long after she died, and he would use oracle bones to petition various ancestors to care for her in the afterlife, and sometimes he would ask if these dreams were because something was wrong with her. Or sometimes he would ask if these dreams about her were to try to tell him something. So she was very clearly on Wu Ding's mind throughout the rest of his life, and he lived for quite a while after Fu Hao died. Another theory is that it wasn't for love, or at least not completely. Multiple reasons can be true. But another possibility is that the way that she died made her ineligible for burial in the royal cemetery. There's evidence that the circumstances of death impacted whether or not someone could be buried for whatever reason, whether it was a religious reason or a hygiene reason, we aren't completely sure. But there is evidence that someone who died in battle or died later as the result of battle wounds would not be allowed in the royal cemetery during this period of ancient China. And instead, they would have been buried separately. Sometimes there's evidence of these tombs on family estates instead of the royal cemetery, so it's kind of hard to tell. It's not as simple as these people were isolated just directly across an official line of marking where the royal cemetery began. We also know that in later periods of China's history, the dead who died of either a very visible disease or a very contagious disease were buried separately. We don't know for sure if this happened during the Shang Dynasty because of all the damage that's been done to the tombs and the lack of clear records about it from that period. But given that later periods did it, and it was something that was picked up on by most cultures around the world throughout history, that you tend to separate the potential cause of a spread of disease from others. So it wouldn't be far-fetched that if she died of some sort of disease that they thought was contagious, or if she did actually get some sort of pandemic virus that had been going around, she might not have been eligible for the royal cemetery. The oracle bones aren't clear on exactly what happened to Fu Hao, but they imply that she didn't die suddenly. It happened over time, like an illness or an injury that got worse. So that's why this theory is in the possibilities section, and it hasn't been ruled out. Fu Hao's burial location could also be for political reasons. Her son with Wu Ding did not end up on the throne, even though Wu Ding clearly cared for Fu Hao and she was the mother of his oldest son, at least the oldest son recorded in the records that we have found. And considering how many there are, chances are that's accurate. And we know that their son survived into adulthood based on artifacts that were buried with Fu Hao that were dedicated from him with her posthumous title. So it's not like they were given to her earlier in life and then she took them with her into the afterlife, you know? It was more so that this was meant to honor her either at the time or in some of the memorial ceremonies that happened after her death. But despite all of that, the cogs of court politics led to a different son succeeding Wu Ding on the throne. This son we do know was younger because he was documented and he had a different mother, because it was very common during this period in most cultures throughout history, the king had multiple wives. The status of being the mother of the next king, especially once that next king did ascend to the throne, that would have elevated her above nearly every other royal title, even Fu Hao's military or religious honors that were bestowed upon her, despite the fact that those were such kingly responsibilities. So, if the succession decision had already been made before Fu Hao died, that could have been what forced her out of the royal cemetery. But she was still kept close because of how important she still was to Wu Ding. Fu Hao wasn't meant to be forgotten, so whatever the reason for her exclusion from the royal cemetery, the original goal was not to hide her tomb or to push her to the margins so that she would fade from history. It wasn't actually until later periods that her contributions as a military general and a diplomat, a religious leader, and a regional ruler were intentionally left out of recorded history, or sometimes attributed to others that we have no proof actually lived. But thanks to archaeology, the patriarchy did not win. She and many other powerful women from the ancient world are actually known to us today despite the attempts to erase them thanks to archaeology. That's honestly one of my most favorite things about archaeology, is being able to find these hidden stories or erased stories and continue their memory. So I'm glad that I could do my part in sharing Fu Hao's story, and thank you for listening. Until next time.
Thanks for listening. Be sure to subscribe to keep up with new releases. Please leave a rating and a comment. That helps the show reach others who may be interested in the past macabre. For access to bonus content from all Archaeology Podcast Network shows, become a member at archpodnet.com/members. That's archpodnet.com/members. You can find show notes for this and other episodes at archpodnet.com/TPM and follow Past Macabre on Instagram. That's PAST_MACABRE. You'll find pictures of the sites and artifacts discussed, Q&A sessions, and episode topic votes. Hope to see you there.
Thanks for listening to this podcast. The Archaeology Podcast Network's chief editor is Rachel Roden. Our executive producer is Ashley Airy. Our social media and newsletter coordinator is Matilda Siebrecht. The APN was founded by Chris Webster and Tristan Boyle on December 1st, 2014. We're supported by our amazing podcast hosts, many volunteers, and listeners like you. Check out membership at www.archpodnet.com/members.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.